Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. In fact, this is the first video version of the podcast, and it'll be known on YouTube as Ravlic at Large. My name is Tom Ravlic, and thank you for joining me for this particular episode. One of the things that people won't necessarily be aware of is a lot of the work the government's doing in buttressing its policy decisions with data, with evidence. And that's one of the most important things that politicians and others need to do is justify what exactly they do in government and why certain policy decisions matter. Now, my guest today, the Assistant Minister responsible for the area, Andrew Leigh, who's an absolute guru on economics, but he's also a stickler for getting the right answers related to uh, trials and getting evidence for policy, also multinational taxation, and if we get time, depending on how we go, also look at the some of the fundamental economic issues people are going to think about as we get closer to the election. Andrew, thank you for joining me.
Real pleasure, Tom. Thanks for having me on.
Absolute pleasure. Now, when sometimes people look at you know policy making in government and wonder where it comes from. Um, you're in a unique position to talk about how you gather evidence to support decisions about programs, where money is allocated, and where money is withdrawn from or programs are stopped. How do you do all of that?
Well, Tom, I'm wearing my I Love Evidence badge because I knew we'd be talking about this topic today and was keen to display my enthusiasm for good quality evidence. Really, what we're doing in government is taking a leaf out of the medical book. Medicine, about 75 years ago, moved towards a system of eminence-based medicine where the greybeards had their way to evidence-based medicine, where you used rigorous approaches such as randomized trials to test whether treatments worked. Sometimes that confirmed conventional wisdom, sometimes it upended it. You had a whole series of treatments in medicine over the years that seemed good in the laboratory but didn't work in the field. So too in policy. Our Australian Centre for Evaluation has been established because we want to get better evidence for what works and what doesn't, partly to get better value for money for taxpayers, but also to make sure that government is doing its utmost to assist those who really need government to be effective. We have oodles of examples of programs that seemed like they might be effective, but when they were subject to a rigorous evaluation, didn't work out. The UK Social Workers in Schools program, beloved by social workers, beloved by schools, turned out not to improve the mental well-being of British teens. And so they pivoted and moved to other approaches to tackle that important problem. The Drug Court in New South Wales, established in 1999, was shown in a randomised trial to be very effective in reducing offending, not only benefiting those who were being sentenced, but also the community at large through reduced offending. More evidence is really just common sense. We're trying to do a lot more of it in government.
What are the immediate examples that come to mind when you think about the use of the randomised trials?
We've got some randomised trials kicking off now in the Department of Employment, looking at employment services and where we might offer better employment services to people who are in the online caseload. For example, offering a career coach, again, voluntary, so you don't have to take it up if you don't want to, but a random group of job seekers would be offered career coaching, others wouldn't, and we compare the outcomes. Career coaches are more expensive than the traditional way in which we've done things, so we need to see whether it's good value for money for Australian taxpayers. In a whole host of other areas across government, we're collaborating with agencies to see whether we can set up rigorous evaluations, get better evidence in government about what works and what doesn't.
Is that where you've got this sort of interesting nexus between a policy position that might be ideologically driven, for example, in terms of social justice, um, and doing the right thing. But when you test something, you actually work out whether what was deemed to be the right thing rhetorically actually works or not.
It's a really nice way of putting it. As a social democrat, I think we should hold very strongly to our values, to creating a more egalitarian, inclusive society. But we should hold particular policies more lightly, be aware that sometimes things that seem good don't turn out to be effective. I basically have one view in social policy, which is that we should evaluate things rigorously. I'm not an adherent to particular programs until they've been proven to work. And that's the approach that good medicos take. Their commitment is to making people healthier, but they don't go through their careers as a particular adherent of a certain chemical unless it's been rigorously proven to improve well-being.
What are some of the examples of this type of work from overseas that have piqued your interest? Because, as you say, you're into evidence, and you're also a researcher in your own right. What are some of the interesting policy um, testing that you've read about and heard about from overseas jurisdictions?
Yeah, one classic is Scared Straight, a program which took delinquent youths and put them behind bars for a day. Low quality evaluations suggested that it reduced offending, but when they did a randomised trial, it turned out to increase offending, which is a reminder that government programs can not only be ineffective, but sometimes can actually be counterproductive. Conversely, cognitive behavioural therapy has been shown in randomised trials to be very effective for that same delinquent youth population. So it's about working out rigorously how to test programs rather than saying, well, it sounds good in theory, so let's roll it out right across the population.
How does that sit, the approach of trialing that we've spoken about up to this point? How does it sit with other work the government does to assess the merits of policy? For example, um, you've got your stock standard consultations that departments might do with stakeholder groups. Yeah, are there any examples you can think of where the approach that you know you're looking at in terms of randomised trials also sits neatly next to the more traditional or the department-led consultation processes with stakeholders?
Yeah, no, you make an interesting point about the interaction between the ways in which government engages. One of the things that's important to know about our approach to randomised trials is they're always done within a careful ethical framework. We want to make sure that people have options to opt out in most cases, and that we're not being overly burdensome. But it's also important to remember that a program that is harming people, such as the old version of Scared Straight, is itself an ethical problem. So we engage with stakeholders as we look at shaping up the evaluation agenda, and also recognise that if you explain clearly to people why you're doing evidence-based policy, then they're more likely to come on board. I think back to some of the early randomised trials of AIDS treatments back in the period where AIDS really was a death sentence. In some of those trials, it wasn't explained to patients why they were being put into a clinical trial. And so patients reputedly switched the vials halfway through. And so everyone in the trial got half a dose of the treatment drug, half the dose of the control drug. That, of course, meant that everyone got a half dose and the trial was rendered completely useless. What they should have done was to engage with those patients and say, look, the reason we're doing this trial is in order to find out what works. And we can't scale up a rollout of AIDS medication without knowing that information. So you've got to bring people along on the evidence journey.
One of the other areas that you're responsible for is looking after multinational taxation. You've been fairly busy, haven't you, with a whole raft of legislation uh, that's gone through related to the Pillar 2 proposals from the OECD and a range of other things. Are you able to recap the year of legislative activity that you've had over the past little while? Because there's been a fair bit you've done.
It has been a lot, Tom, and it's been something that we worked on a lot in opposition and hit the ground running when we came into government. Basically, when multinationals are trying to reduce their tax bill in Australia, they're doing that by trying to increase their deductions. And one of the tricks they've been using to increase deductions that was loading a lot of debt onto the Australian arm of the multinational. And so it had big interest payments to deduct from the tax bill. These internal loans were getting out of control, and we passed legislation that curtails the use of debt deductions as a way of reducing multinationals' tax bills. We've also been among the first set of countries to implement the global floor on company tax. That matters for all countries, but particularly for Australia, whose 30% corporate tax rate is a higher rate than you see in some other jurisdictions. So the race to the bottom really imperiled Australia, and we set about implementing the Pillar 2 of the OECD's two-pillar agreement quickly in order to make sure that Australia could, in certain cases where other countries weren't imposing the global minimum rate, impose top-up taxes. And then we've got transparency measures. So if you're a listed company, you have to disclose your country of tax domicile. If you're tendering for a big government tender, you've got to say where your company is headquartered. Now in legislation that just passed through Parliament recently, you will have large multinationals will have to disclose on a country-by-country basis the amount of tax paid in various jurisdictions.
One of the things that has been prominent in the public eye over the past almost 2 years now is the issue of how advisors interact with the tax regime. Do the changes, in your view, create a different kind of environment for the beast that is a tax advisor in terms of dealing with their clients, but maybe multinationals?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly recognise that a large, complex corporation will need professional advice, but the PwC scandal did highlight some problems with the way in which certain advisors operated. The use of confidential information garnered through a confidential consultation process by PwC then saw that company offer products towards its multinational clients that was seeking to circumvent the government's legislation. We were shocked by that, and that led to a range of changes, and you've seen the fallout for PwC itself. It is really important that we get thoughtful advice from those experts, but it's important too that those experts understand that part of providing an opportunity to see draft legislation, comment on draft legislation, is that there's a clear firewall from using that information to benefit their clients.
If we look at the change in law, and we talk about in the area of accounting ethics and the discussion about ethical conduct more generally, there is a discourse that focuses on the way in which people behave when there's no guardrails, and then when the law is imposed, that it causes people to constrain their behaviour or limit any sort of excesses of their imagination, shall we say. Does it concern you that the government has had to put more legislation in place in order to encourage people to be less adventurous?
Yeah, I think it's an inevitable result of the PwC scandal. And of course, that work has been led by Treasurer Jim Chalmers and the Assistant Treasurer Stephen Jones, working really to make sure that our system is as robust as possible and to reflect the strong community concern over that scandal.
One of the interesting things about the multinational uh, space that you've inhabited is that this isn't the end of the story, is it? There's a lot more work to be done. Where do you go now once you've sorted out the Pillar 2, the transparency measures, and also the you know, shutting the gate on mucking about with the intercompany loans?
Yeah, the natural spot then is to look at Pillar 1, and Pillar 1 is the allocation of taxing rights among very large multinationals. So Pillar 2, that global minimum tax floor, applies basically to billion-dollar firms. Pillar 1 is for firms with turnover above $20 billion a year. So the largest of the large. And that allocates taxing rights across jurisdictions. So Australia is committed to implementing that, working with other countries about how the best way of making that happen.
How do you get that to work well? Because tax is a universal matter, but every country has its own kind of dialect when it comes to legislation. Each country comes from a different place. How do you make that work?
Yeah, it's a really good point, Tom, and I love your analogy with languages and dialects. It is an ongoing big piece of public policy. Treasury is engaged with counterpart agencies right across the OECD and that broader group of around 130 countries. So Australia's on board for getting it done, but the implementation of Pillar 1 is trickier than the implementation of Pillar 2.
Talking about tax and Pillar 1 and other things, there's a lot of jargon involved in taxation and economic talk generally. Of course, you've got a book out called The Shortest History of Economics. Anyone that wants to have a look at it, go out and see it. I've read a part of it. I still need to finish it, and it's certainly a very good primer for economic enthusiasts or people who want to learn more. Andrew, how do we explain some of the fundamentals of, say, government budget management to people who are going to be thrust into a discourse as we get closer to the election? I mean, for example, how do we explain to people the concept of something being off budget outside the GGS, which to you and I is something we would understand, but for someone out there in Bankstown or Brunswick or up in Brisbane that doesn't deal with it every day, it can be alienating when they confront that language. What does it mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think whether you're in Bellevue Hill or Blacktown, there's many more interesting things going on in the lives of the typical Australian than multinational tax. Now, our obligation is to speak clearly about what we're doing without diving so deeply into the details that people's eyes glaze over. Holding multinationals to account is an important goal for the government. And we're doing this, Tom, not only to raise revenue, but also to get a level playing field. So a tech startup in a garage in Perth is not going to be immediately hiring accountants to figure out how to divert its profits off to a tax haven. So if it's competing, it shouldn't be competing with one hand tied behind its back. Multinational tax fairness isn't just about revenue, it's also about a level playing field for small businesses going up against larger firms.
More broadly, as we get into election mode, there will be a lot of economic terms thrown around that people won't necessarily understand. How do we explain? How should people sort of think about a term like cost of living. What is meant by cost of living?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just going to the challenges of inflation and how people are feeling that the prices are going up. Really, the increase in prices is most challenging when you've got it outpacing your wages. That was the situation when we came to office, where real wages were falling. We've now seen successive quarters of real wage growth, which is important. So after taking account of the change in prices, people's pay packets are going up. And that'll be a clear message we'll take to the election, that the cost of living reforms we've put in place have provided relief, whether that's through the increases on Commonwealth rental assistance, improving childcare, the changes we've made in providing HECS relief, and as well as that, turning around to budget surpluses, which give the Reserve Bank the freedom that it needs in order to make its own independent decisions on interest rates.
How do you explain to people, to a layperson, if we play a game for a moment and imagine I'm a bear with a little brain, how do you explain to a layperson the difference between what the Reserve Bank does and what the government does when it comes to managing the budget to achieve a better fiscal policy outcome?
Well, the big job of the Reserve Bank is to smooth the business cycle, to make sure that the ups and downs of the economy aren't as large as they would otherwise be. And it does that through changing interest rates, which are essentially the price of borrowing and therefore the price of bringing consumption forward into the present. That has an impact through businesses, but also through households. In Australia, the household channel is bigger because we have more of us on variable rate mortgages. If you look at a country like the United States, the impact is largely coming through corporate borrowings. At the same time, the government has a responsibility to make sure that it's working in collaboration with the central bank. The surpluses we've brought down, the cost of living relief, all have made a tangible difference to reducing inflation. Despite being opposed by the Liberal and National parties when we brought them to the Parliament.
Now, you've been really generous with your time today, Andrew. If people want to know more about the things you're doing and the speeches you're delivering, where can they go?
Well, my website's the modestly named andrewleigh.com. People are welcome to sign up for the monthly email that we send out. It goes out just once a month and keeps up to date with what we're up to. I'm on the major social media platforms. I've got a couple of podcasts, one on speeches and conversations, another one on ethics and values called The Good Life. And then I try and get out there into the community as frequently as I can through street corner meetings, town hall meetings and the like. And on top of that, also am trying to write opinion pieces and be out there in the media when you can. It's a much more fragmented media landscape, Tom, even than when I entered Parliament 14 years ago in 2010. So reaching as many people as possible is challenging, but it's also one of the pleasures of this job, to speak to people, to gather their ideas and to shape better policy as a result.
I guess I mentioned the shortest history of economics earlier. How did you find time in the middle of all the work you've just enunciated to write the book?
Well, the shortest history of economics was largely written in the tail end of the pandemic, with a product of frustration over lockdowns and being in opposition. In government, I focused more on writing laws than writing books, and in being part of that reform journey. And I was really proud to see so much of our legislative agenda passing through the Parliament just at the start of the month. really makes a difference for Australians to have that updated merger regime, to have the food and grocery code getting a fair deal for farmers, to have build to rent and help to buy kicking off. These are big reforms, and it's really pleasing to me as somebody who got into politics in order to make a difference on good economic policy, seeing these things become a reality.
Is there much downtime for you over the Christmas break before you head into what will be an election season?
Spend a little bit of time with the family. My folks are in Sydney, so we'll spend time there, throw the kids in the pool, get a good chance to do some hot Sydney runs, and then hit the ground running for 2025, which will be a hotly contested election. My personal view is that Peter Dutton is way too much of a risk for the economy, and we'll be making the case that we have done a lot, we have a lot more to do, and you can't risk Dutton.
Andrew, thank you so much for joining me for this particular segment.
Real pleasure, Tom. Thanks to you, and thanks for all you do.
Okay. I've been talking to Andrew Leigh, the Assistant Minister in the Albanese government, looking at a whole range of issues from international taxation, randomised trials, and also the broader economy. Thanks for joining me, and we'll have another episode of Ravlic at Large, a production of Critical Line Item Productions, coming to you soon.